turnout, and hopefully there's something here for everyone. It's a little bit different for me to be presenting to a modelling group because it's not an area of expertise of mine. In fact, Danielle's going to let me come along to one of her classes so that I can learn some financial modelling, so I'm looking forward to that. But as Danielle said, my expertise is really with Power Pivot and Power Query primarily, and I like to talk about modern Excel, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Excel. I mean, many of you would know quite a bit about the history of Excel, and then I'm going to spend most of the time tonight just giving you some demos of some of the capabilities of Power Pivot and Power Query, primarily those two tools, and just to give you a sense of how far Excel has come from its roots as a traditional spreadsheet tool. So it's no less a traditional spreadsheet tool than it ever was, but it's got these new capabilities that many people haven't heard about. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So maybe 10 minutes of slides tops, and then most of my time hands-on. I'd love you to shout out if you've got any questions, or if you don't understand what I'm doing, or I'm going too slow or going too fast. Please let me know what you think, and I'll be happy to to interact and talk as we go through. So I'm going to talk about a brief history of Excel, and then talk about my definition of modern Excel, what that is, and then the bulk of the session is going to be really about showing you what it can do for you. So I'd just like to start off with a quick show of hands. So who uses pivot tables fairly regularly in their job today? Okay, so 75% probably, so okay, good. And then before this meetup, before you saw this topic, who'd never heard of Power Pivot before you saw this topic? Okay, so that's actually quite a good number, because I was saying I was at CPA Congress in Brisbane a week and a half ago, and 75% of the room, so maybe about 45 people, had never heard of Power Pivot before the masterclass which I was advertised. What about Power Query? Who's never heard of Power Query? Okay, so more, so that's relatively newer. What about Power BI, powerbi.com? Who's never heard of that? Okay, so they got some marketing. Microsoft's got some marketing to do there. All right, so who's heard of them but hasn't really used them in a meaningful way? Okay, so and that's also very common too. So hopefully I'll give you a bit of a taste of what's possible here, and that'll give you some motivation to find out more, and maybe get some benefits from that. And is there anyone actually using the tools today in their jobs? I know there's a couple of guys here from a couple of the other meetups that we've been to, so I know this will be pretty bread and butter stuff for you, I'm sure. Okay, briefly, a history of spreadsheets. I don't know how much some of you know about these things, but before about 1980, 79, the world of PCs was there was a plethora of different devices out there. There was no standard operating systems, and in fact, I used to play on some of these things, certainly the TRS-80 and the Commodore 64. I had a friend who had a VZ200. Unfortunately,
Who made the VZ200?
You did?
I didn't, but who did?
I had a mate who had one of those, so yeah. But the reality when it comes to spreadsheets is that these tools were really before VisiCalc and Apple. And if you do any online reading about VisiCalc, VisiCalc was the killer app. And people went from buying these sort of all over the place hardware devices, and they'd heard about VisiCalc, which was the predecessor for Excel, in fact the predecessor of Lotus 123. And great background. And people would go into the shop and say, I want the hardware that has VisiCalc. Just give me a computer that has VisiCalc. That was the killer app. And for those of you that are in financial modelling, imagine trying to do your financial modelling on literally on a broadsheet paper or on a mainframe computer. And this really changed the world, this product. And then Lotus 123 came along. That was the product that I started with. Anyone use Lotus 123? Slash file save and replace. I could hit those keys so fast. So anyway, this was right up to about 1982, and this came out on the IBM PC. This is well before Windows. And then Microsoft Excel came in. I was actually doing this research. It was actually first released for the Apple II. Microsoft didn't even release it for the IBM PC at all. it didn't actually come out onto IBM until 1987 when they had Windows version 1. They never released it in DOS. And this was also thought to be one of the killer apps for Apple that made them successful in the early days. And then we went through a whole range of evolution of Microsoft products, Excel products and versions. In about 93, the pivot table came in. In fact, before that, does anyone remember crosstab? We used to have crosstabs before pivot tables. The pivot tables were a real groundbreaker. And then I sort of refer to modern Excel as being from about 2010 on. So in 2010, we got slices. Has anyone not heard of slices? Or maybe I should ask who has heard of slices. People don't put their hands up if they say not heard of. But slices were great. Power Pivot and Power Query are both available in 2010. And so this is really the start of the modern era of the new reporting tools that are a part of Excel. So I just want to briefly talk about those tools. So there's Power Pivot, and Power Pivot is a data modelling tool. It's a tool that people like us who are Excel users can use themselves to do quality, robust reporting. And that's a big change from the old world of having to do enterprise strength reporting where you got the IT department in and it took months, 6 months, 12 months, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do any sort of meaningful reporting tools. There's Power Query, and once Power Pivot really got going, Microsoft needed a way to help people get the data from where it's currently sitting, reshape it into the right shape for reporting, and then load it into Excel. And so Power Query was born, and this is now my number 2 favourite product after Power Pivot. And there's a couple of other products that they released, Power View and Power Map. Both of these tools have sort of morphed now into Power BI. This one actually is installed in 2016, but it's completely disabled, and I don't think you'll ever see another evolution of that product, and possibly not this one either. And then most recently Power BI, and Power BI has a desktop version. It's a complete standalone version of Power Pivot plus Power Query plus Power BI online visualization tool, completely free, download. You don't need Excel at all, it's incredible. But you can use this tool to build data models and then load them up into the cloud on Power BI. Now, I'm not planning to talk about Power BI tonight. I think that's a topic in its own right. But if you go to powerbi.com and have a look, there's so much video out there that you get a sense of what it's all about. But these tools basically, or exactly, are the same technology that Power BI uses for data modelling and data acquisition. And then there's a stack of third-party tools that are available as well. So Power Planner is a tool that takes a pivot table and makes it editable, and you can make changes in your pivot table and save it back to a database. Power Update is a tool for refreshing all of these workbooks that you end up producing for your reporting. Dax Studio is a more advanced tool to let you get into your data models and do a whole lot of analysis. So there's just a stack of stuff out there, I guess, is the key message. But for the rest of today, I'm really just going to talk about these two here, which are, I think, the most important modern Excel tools that are available. Let me briefly talk about what Power Pivot can do for you. First of all, it's got enormous capacity. So you would probably all be aware Excel's got a 1 million row limit in a spreadsheet. I don't know if you ever tried to put 1 million rows in Excel, probably with a few VLOOKUPs or 500,000 VLOOKUPs, but it grinds to a halt well before you get to 1 million rows. I've got workbooks that I manage for a client. They've got 50 million rows of data in them, and it takes 2 seconds to refresh the pivot table. So this is really a game changer when it comes to data capacity. And it's also really fast, as I said, not sub-second when you get to 50 million rows, but if you've got a million rows in a Power Pivot workbook, it's nothing, and you would expect sub-second performance. There's a big focus on building once and then reusing many times, and so there's none of this sort of building a bespoke report for a particular need, and then someone says to you, well, that's great to give me sales by month, but can you give it to me by quarter, by product, by subcategory? It's a complete rewrite if you're doing this in a traditional Excel world. If you're using Power Pivot and these tools, you can pump out a new report literally in 5 minutes. And lastly, and importantly, is that it works over multiple tables. And so the world of VLOOKUP and multiple VLOOKUPs is completely gone in a Power Pivot world. And so I'm going to show you that in the demos. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I'm going to kick into a couple of demos here. Any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? I'm going to have to sit down so that I can use my mouse and stuff, but as I said, shout out if you can't hear me, or if you've got any questions, then please, yeah, just yell out. So I'm going to start off with a general ledger example. So literally what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab a GL extract from a test system, and I'm going to join it together with an accounts table and some department numbers and stuff. So things that you would typically do when you're getting an extract from a financial system and want to do some sort of reporting on it. Very basic, but it'll give you a bit of a sense of how Power Pivot works. Okay, and then we'll move on to a sales example. Okay, so I've got a blank workbook here that I'm going to start with. The only thing that's in this workbook is this table of department numbers, department names, which I'll look at shortly. So within Excel, if you've got the right version, you've got this Power Pivot menu here. It's turned off by default. You can do a Google search to find out how to turn it on. And when you click on this Manage button, what it does is opens up a Power Pivot window, which is a separate application. And so you can actually see there's actually two windows here now. There's an Excel window, and then there's a Power Pivot window. And this is actually the data modeling tool, and then this is effectively the visualization tool using pivot tables or charts and so on. Okay, I'm competing with someone who's not very happy. All right, so what I'm going to do is the first step of any data model is to go and acquire the data. So I've got a database here, and so here's my GL database. It's about 4.5 meg worth of data. So I'm not going to obviously go through everything that I'm doing here. I just want to give you a bit of a sense of what's possible. So there's a pretty useful wizard here, and it gives you a list of all the items that are available to be imported. And so I'm going to bring in a table of dates and the chart of accounts and my GL transactions. So this is coming from my source data. And you can do things here like I can change the name of my table, which is going to appear in my data model. It maintains a relationship back with the source data. So anything I do here, next month when you get the new GL extract, you just hit refresh and it just brings the whole lot back in again. There's none of this sort of rework stuff. That's part of the reusability process. Okay, so I'm going to bring in those three tables. There's 60,000 rows in the transaction table. And so I'm just going to quickly save that and just pull it up on the screen. So there's the database, 4.6 meg, and here's the workbook, so just over a meg. So you've got about a 4.5-fold compression. That's pretty typical. It does depend on your data, but you can certainly expect that sort of compression ratio. All right, so now what people would normally do once you're bringing that in is that you would write a whole lot of VLOOKUPs so that you can join your data together. And Power Pivot solves that problem with a visualization that allows you to join the tables. I just quickly mentioned, so this is a calendar table, so it's got a date column and then information about which year, which quarter, so all the stuff that you're going to use for your reporting. And then here's my chart of accounts, which is account number, department number, and here are the GL transactions. And so basically what I need to do is I need to join these tables together so that they act as one when we start doing our pivot tables. Now one of the limitations of Power Pivot is it's not possible to join what's called a many-to-many relationship. So I've got an account number here and an account number there. And if I try and join those two things together, it won't let me. It's not like an Access database where you can do a many. For those of you that know this stuff, you can't do a many-to-many join. And that's a design decision that they made to make it really fast and snappy, so they had to make compromises. But there's a solution to the problem, and so I'm just going to jump to the chart of accounts. And if we could concatenate these two columns together, that would create a unique value that I can join. And so a lot of this stuff is almost identical to Excel, so you can use concatenation functions like that to write a concatenation of two columns, and I'm going to call this account department. I can't do that, account num department. Right, so I've created a new unique column in my chart of accounts, and I'm going to do the same in the transaction table, which is account and department. And I'll give it the same name. Don't have to give it the same name, but I will. And now I've got a unique key that allows me to join those two tables together, just like that. And once I've made that relationship, those two tables will act as if they were one. Sorry, question?
Yeah, can you just explain why it wouldn't allow count to account before?
A many to many, account to account. Yeah, so in the accounts table, if I jump to this table and if I sort A to Z, come down the bottom maybe. So there are duplicates here. Can't find any. Here we go. So see here, there's 3 86020, right? So this appears 3, 4, 5, 6 times in that table, and the relationship, there has to be one on the lookup table, and you can have many transactions in the data table, and that allows you to filter and do slice and dicing in pivot tables.
Because the uniqueness lies in the account department and account number
combination. Correct. It's the combination that is unique, and so I just created that. Now not all of this is best practice necessarily, so there are better ways of doing some of these things, but for the sake of the exercise, a big part of Power Pivot is doing this rapid prototyping. I want to build something, just let me get going, and then you can go back and make some changes later on.
Power Pivot does actually have a grungy workaround for that.
Yeah, well you can change it back in the source or whatever.
Yes.
But I'm going to join the transaction date up to my calendar, and now I've got 3 tables that are basically working as one. So I'm going to jump straight into Excel now, and I'm going to put a new pivot table. And so here's my 3 tables. So this is different to traditional Excel. You would normally only see a single table of values here, and so you can put calendar year on columns, and I can open this table and find group and subgroup, put them on rows, and in fact for the amount, you would typically in an Excel workbook, you would just drag your column of values down onto the table like this. Now there's, when I teach Power Pivot courses, and doing this is called an implicit measure, and when this happens, you don't actually know what's happened under the hood. So Power Pivot and Excel have created these are called measures, and you actually don't know what's happening underneath. So I always tell my students to write these measures themselves, and that's what I'm about to do now. So I'm going to create a new measure, and we'll call it, what do I call it, total amount, I think. And so there's a whole formula language. This is called DAX. It's a big topic in its own right. But for the sake of the exercise, I'll just quickly write it's the sum of the transaction, not accounts, transactions amount column, which is basically what you did automatically before. And I can apply formatting and stick it into my pivot table. And I mean, it looks the same as it was before, but we're starting a modelling journey to be able to use these tools over and over. Now, it's very common now, once you get into this sort of GL, that you'll want to switch your revenues around with your expenses, put them at the top. The next thing that people typically want to do is they don't want negative signs on their revenues. So the good thing about Power Pivot, I can just come back in here and just flip the sign by multiplying it by -1, and you've got you've now got your revenues showing up positive. The downside is you've got your expenses negative. Now some people want to have expenses negative, some people don't. There's a more complex formula which I could write to determine whether it was revenues or expenses and flip the sign on one and not the other. But the point is, you can do whatever you want to meet your reporting requirements. And then I mentioned before about slices, and so if I took my department number and added that as a slicer, I can click on this slicer by department number and have my pivot table refresh, which is all well and good, but ideally you'd have the department name, not the department number. And so just to show you an alternate way of importing data, I can take a table of data like this in my Excel spreadsheet, turn it into a table, I'll give it a name, these are our departments, and I can also add that to my data model. I'll try to. Power Pivot can be a little bit flaky at times. It's version 2016 is much improved, but you can normally recover. Let's try again. Add the data model. So now I've got a fourth table in my data model, and I can, same as I did with the other one, I can just join my department number to my departments table, and then I'll have an extra table here, and I can just add a slicer. And now I've got reporting with all of my departments rather than the department numbers. So, I mean, look, obviously I've done this before, so, you know, I know what I'm doing, but, you know, this is typical experience with people as they build their skill. You know, you can throw this type of report out fairly quickly. It does depend on the quality and the cleanliness of your data. So if your data's really dirty, if you've got spaces against your department numbers, you know, there's going to be some problems. But that's something that's a job for Power Query, which I'll show you shortly. And you know, all of these problems can be solved. I always tell people that every problem you're going to have in Power Pivot, someone's already solved it. It's just about trying to find that person and you know, learn from what they share on how to solve those problems. Might just pause for a breath for a sec. And anyone got any questions on that? Yeah.
Yeah. Just coming back to where you created that account key.
Yeah.
So you had to do that because you can't. So you can't join, say, the account fields in those tables, and then do a second.
No. So Power Pivot.
Can you make one join between?
Yeah. Technically, you can have multiple joins, but there's only one that's active at any one time. And the active join is always one to many, so you always have to have a unique key in your lookup table. And the lookup table, these are the lookup tables, right? So these are the ones that we would traditionally have gone and written VLOOKUPs against. So we'd get our transaction table from the GL, and then because we don't want to see the department number, you'd go and do a VLOOKUP on the departments table and bring it back into your table so you can stick it into a pivot table.
Yeah.
And so these tables are those lookup tables. They're the ones that we're going to put on our, you know, on columns on our pivot table, on rows on our pivot table, and all the transaction data is sitting here in this table here, and they're the numbers that we're going to add up. So this table here is always going to have multiple rows for every key, and that's fine. But these other lookup tables have to have one and only one.
Yeah.
That's actually changing with 2016, sorry, but that's the way it is.
I understand that. And, I'm sort of talking, I guess, you've got three fields which make up your key in a normal, say, in Access.
In Access, you can create three relationships, and it will give you a unique one-to-many relationship. You can't do that in Power Pivot. Yeah, you have to create a concatenation. It has to be a single column that is unique in order to be able to make the join. At least in 2013. Okay, and then as I said before, at the end of the month when the new data is available back in your data source, what you do is you click on right-click here and you go refresh, and the new data comes in. That's it. There's no rework in your reloading the data in the tables, and the connections have been made, and provided the database is available and the new data is available, it'll just come into the pivot table and you're done. Now, of course, you can build out these pivot tables to be a lot more capable than the one that I've done here. And then there's also this concept of reuse. So if I want to create a new pivot table from scratch, you know, I could open up any one of these tables and build a different shape report for a different purpose. And so let's do something like this, and then order number. And this is this concept of reuse. You don't have to basically create a brand new bespoke solution every time you have a new need. You've built your data model and you can just quickly pump out a new pivot table that's built for a different purpose with slices and what have you. Okay, any other questions on GL before I move on to a slightly more...
Can we just go through the bit when you looked at the code for the summation?
Yeah, so when this is called a Dax Measure Formula, and so this is a typical database aggregation formula. So so this is a column of data, and in a traditional Excel pivot table, you just take that column and drop it into values, and it would automatically sum it up for you. What's actually happening behind the scene is that the pivot table is writing this formula. I want you to sum this column for me. Okay, and I multiplied it by minus 1 to flip the sign. But I could have equally... In fact, let me show you some more examples of that in the sale. I've got a sales example now that I want to briefly show you. Danielle, you'll keep an eye on time for me. Just let me know how I'm going. So I've got 3 or 4 more of these. But
yeah, probably about another 10 minutes or so.
on Power Pivot or on everything?
No, everything.
Everything.
And then questions.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to do a rapid then on this sales one, so I'll just take a couple of minutes. The main difference with this example that I'm going to show you here, I'm going to bring some data in once again from an Access database. And this is I don't know if you've heard of the AdventureWorks database. In financial modelling you might not have, but it's basically a retail business. It's a retail chain of bike stores. They sell bike helmets and boots and clothes and that sort of stuff. And so a typical retail business would have a stack of tables of calendar. They've got customers, products, they've got sales, transactions and territories that they operate in. I'm going to quickly bring in those 5 tables. The same refresh paradigm applies. So next month or tomorrow, the sales data, you just hit refresh and it brings the latest data in. I definitely need to create relationships between these tables. And so this table here has got 60,000 transactions in it, and here's the product number, and that joins to my product table. So that's effectively, I've just written 18 VLOOKUPs by making that one drag and drop. Same here with order date, same here with customer key, same here with territory key. So, those 4 drag and drops is every VLOOKUP you need to write to make this data work together.
Matt, we're okay for time.
Okay.
You don't need to rush.
Okay. Hope everyone else is okay. Okay, we'll do that. All right. So, so I'm going to create another one of these measures like I did before. So let me grab. I'm going to put my product categories down here, and I'm going to create a new field, and this one will be total sales. And one of those days, and it's the same formula as before. I'm summing up the sales table. Basically, that's the value of the transaction, and I can give it currency formatting here. So you only do it once. You give the formatting into the back end, and that formatting will live with the model for the life of the model. And so look, that's nothing too groundbreaking, but something a little bit more complex would be something like how many invoices have we had? So let's call this total invoices. And for this one, I'm going to do and there's a whole lot of different formulas that are available in DAX. But if I can count the sales order number, which is basically the invoice number, if I do a distinct count of how many invoice numbers I've got in my database, I'll know how many invoices I've had. And so that'll be a number, 1,000 separator. So now I know how many sales I've got, how many invoices I've got, and then start to get even more value adding is what's the average sales price per invoice. Right, and so this is going to be as simple as there's actually a divide function here, total sales divided by total invoices. And this, as a concept, average sales price per invoice, that does not exist in my raw data. Well, I've created that, right, on the fly in a couple of minutes. And let's do that as a number, so that'll be $1, 2 decimal places.
And I think divide gracefully handy just in case with the denominator
Correct.
zero.
Yeah, it's the safe divide. If you get a divide by zero error, it still works. And so, I've just very quickly pulled together a couple of measures, and I can just end up with average sales price per invoice, and I can create my pivot table. I'll put a slicer on gender, and I might put years, calendar year on columns, and maybe I'll put my countries down here instead of categories. So all of this stuff is completely reusable. You write it once, perhaps because you want to analyse your product categories, but it's completely then reusable across your customer base, your territories. If you want to see, which territories are performing better than other territories. Very quick to produce. Now these are very fundamental, basic DAX formulas. There are definitely more complex DAX formulas that you can learn and will grow with you as you get better with the technology. But as far as being able to take disconnected data and pump out a meaningful report very quickly, Power Pivot, you just can't beat it. Okay, I think that's enough for Power Pivot for today. Any questions on that before we move on to Power Query? Okay, all good. Just close that down.
What is it? Is a ribbon there? Ribbon KPIs. What does that do?
It's a visualization tool that allows you to take your sales number and set a budget number, and then perhaps have a set a target of being 5% up on last year, 5% up on budget. And if you get 5% up, the green lamp comes on, and if you're between 0 and 5, the orange lamp comes on. So it's another visualization tool. It was really written for Power View. It's a little bit clunky in 2013. It works a lot better in 2010. But a lot of these things that they've done are really precursors for Power BI, which is where the money is going now, which is the cloud-based service. Okay, so let's, oops, wrong one. Okay, so that's Power Pivot. Let's talk about Power Query. So Power Query is an ETL tool. It's designed to extract, transform and load your data from wherever it exists in the world today into Excel or into Power Pivot, depending on what you're wanting to do. So it's really good at cleaning dirty data. It's good at reshaping your data, so that if you've got a scenario like this where someone sends you a spreadsheet and there's one tab for every month, but you're trying to get it into one big table so you can do the analysis on it. Power Pivot eats this for lunch. I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute, actually. It's also really good as an auditing tool, and I've got a demo that I'll show you where I can get a list of invoices that we're expecting payment for, and remittance advice from a customer, and join them together and find out which ones they've paid, which ones they haven't paid, which ones are short paid, which ones are correctly paid. Power Query is really good for that. And importantly, it's a repeatable process. So everything that I'm going to show you in Power Query now is a step-by-step process that stores the procedures, and then you rerun them over and over again on new data to get the same outcome without having to redo all the work. So in some ways, it's a bit like a VBA as a programming tool. Power Query is to data what VBA is to spreadsheet repetitiveness and automation. Okay, but I think it makes sense to show you a demo, because that's where you'll get the best sense of what Power Query can do. Now, Power Query is it's a free download. If you just search for it, you can download it. It works for 2010 and 2013. For 2016, it comes pre-installed, so you get it whether you want it or not. And hopefully, after you've seen this, you'll be interested in downloading it. So I'm going to start with this consolidate worksheet example that I had up on the slide. So let me open this workbook. So typical scenario, So here's the scenario. I've got a spreadsheet that was being sent to me by someone, and there's a tab here with January sales and another tab for February. It's unbelievable how often this happens, and it's just not a good place to start. Ideally, you wouldn't start in this scenario. And I've got a few sheets here that don't even have any data on them. So that's going to be my source data. Presumably, next month, whoever sent me this spreadsheet is going to send me another spreadsheet with June in it, right? And then next month they'll send me another one with July in it. And I just don't want to have to go back and do this all over again. So I'm going to close that workbook, and we're going to use that as our source. And here's my new tab, same sort of turning on process that I described or didn't describe with Power Pivot. You have to Google it. And so I'm going to start a new workbook. And now I'll start a new Power Query, and I'm going to import data, in this case from a file, which is an Excel file. And if I can find my demos. So there's that worksheet that I had. So I click OK. And what Power Query does is it brings up a wizard, and this folder here is effectively the workbook, and then underneath that folder are each of the objects in that workbook which I can import. But I'm going to select the top workbook and click Edit, and it just starts to take me through the cleansing process. And so you can see now that Power Query has said, well, I've got sheets named January to May, and then 2 sheets, and then in each one of those is a table of data. So the first thing I want to do is I want to clear out anything that's not a month name sheet, because I only want the month names, right? So it's simple point and click stuff. So I can just do a text filter, does not begin with sheet. Oops. And this is a repeatable process now, because if someone adds a sheet 3, sheet 4, sheet 5, they're all going to get filtered out when I get the new spreadsheet sent to me. So now I've got a number of sheets. I can then just delete these columns, I don't want those. And then I'll click on this expand button, and basically that goes into each of those sheets and opens up every one on the same tab within Power Query. The problem I've got now though is that this first row is the headings that I want, and so there's a little button here, use first row as headers. So now I've got my column headings correct, and I don't want this one to be called January, I'm going to call this month. So I can just change it like that. And there's one last problem with this particular workbook, and that is, remember, every page had a heading on it, and I don't want all those headings coming in down my list. In fact, if I open this product key, come down the bottom here, you actually can't even see it at the moment, but there's definitely another product key heading somewhere down on the top of the February page. So I just click Load More, and go down the bottom, there it is, and I can just deselect that, and now any row that's got product key in the product key column will just be removed from the data set. Click OK, and I can give my table a name, and just close and load. I'm going to load it into Excel so that you can see it, but you have a choice. You can load it directly into Power Pivot if you want, and then start doing your reporting and data modelling over the top. So there we go, 24,000 rows of data back in my source spreadsheet. And then to prove the point about reuse, if I take a copy of this and call this June and save it. Obviously the data's the same, but I've currently got 24,000 rows. I just hit refresh, and it didn't like it. Okay. I've obviously done something not quite right. Don't you love demos? Let me just do a refresh here. Okay. Oh, I see what I've done. So what I did was I put the new sheet at the front here, and so when I brought the data in before, I renamed the January sheet. So the new sheet's going to come in June after May. I'll try again. Now we've got 30,000 rows up from 24,000 rows. So repeatable process. Behind the scenes, as I clicked and made these processes here, there is actually a formula language tool that's happening behind the scenes. And if you get really interested and funky, you can go and start learning how to program in this language. It's the Power Query formula language. But you don't have to do that to get great value from Power Query.
If the prior month's data had been altered, how does that flow?
It's a complete delete and replace paradigm, which is probably the ideal outcome. So yeah, if the person sending you the file made a change back in June or May and sent you June, it'll get picked up. Yeah. Okay, so that's a simple consolidate worksheets example. I'll just save that and close it. So I've got I can show you a similar example where you bring data in. I'll perhaps, just for the sake of time, I won't show this one, but here I've got a folder which has got multiple CSV files in it. The same process applies, but instead of combining multiple sheets from one file, you can put multiple files from one folder. It's exactly the same process, almost identical process. And so some people will send you a file that grows every month. Some people will send you a new file every month. Right? Depending on which one you've got, then there's a process to support that. So just for the sake of variety, I won't show you that one. I do want to show you this web scrape example. I love web scraping. So I'm going to do a search here for top movies of all time. And so now my internet connection is not real fast, so you just have to bear with me a little bit as we bring this data in. But here's a website. I don't know if you ever tried to get data into Excel off a website. It's not a pretty thing. You get all these non-printing characters and all sorts of things happening. But here's one I prepared before, of course. This is a website that's got a list of the all-time great movies. I'm going to switch over to a list view. And now here's a list of those movies. Okay, so it goes down to 100, I believe. So all I have to do is copy that URL and go to a new workbook in Power Query. And Power Query allows you to bring in from the web with this button. You just paste the URL. And what it does is it goes out, analyses the web page, looks for data that exists in a table, and will come back and present you with a list of the objects that are available to be imported. So you'll start to see sort of similar, familiar user interface here. This is the slow bit, so sorry about that. Okay, so here we've got a table. This is the one I want. I don't know what this table 1 is. That's nothing, and there's something else at the bottom. So I actually want this table here. So I can just click on it and go Edit. And there's a whole lot of garbage that's going to come in when you start to do this stuff. But this is the number of people that have rated it. So I'm going to perhaps keep that one. Here's the final rating. And what else we got here? The year it was launched, the rank. And so I just selected the columns I want, right click, remove other columns. It will just basically get rid of the rubbish for me, and then we can rename these. This is the rank, title, year, this is the score,